Would like to welcome now to the stage for a fireside chat with me, Evan Feigenbaum. Evan is somebody who I have long admired for somebody who is just so clear-sighted, who really, I think, has responded in very, very interesting ways to a changing context in Southeast Asia, which is what we're going to be discussing today, sort of as proxy for the broader Asia-Pacific region and how that region, things are playing out in this contest between China and the United States. He is so free of wishful thinking, so free of sentimentality. And so, Evan, please join me on stage, and I look forward to this conversation. Is your mic on? It's on. It's all on.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, it's on.
Perfect. Great. So, Evan, this conference, the theme is, what does China want? So I really want my first question to you to sort of focus on that, but in the context of this. Look, you've described yourself, you've copped to being a card-carrying member of the American strategic class. After all, you are vice president for studies at Carnegie, and you had a long, storied career as a diplomat, so you are a strategist. Now, what does your notional Chinese counterpart think of this? As the card-carrying members of the Chinese strategic class view the region and the forces at work, are there people in China who are thinking beyond merely countering American power in the region? Are there people who are thinking about what a post-American Pacific actually looks like? Because as far as I can tell, I mean, what I hear is a lot of sort of nebulous concepts and about common security, about the assertion of ideas like non-interference, but largely devoid of substance, I have to say. What are you hearing?
Okay, first, thanks for having me. Second, can I just say how much I like the capsule description of this session outside? It says, Evan Feigenbaum and Kaiser Kuo are going to argue about securitization of the region. So it already knows that we like to go at it. So we'll try not to go at it.
Let's go at it.
Okay, we'll go at it. What does China think? It's a very psychoanalytic question. So I'm a former policymaker. I guess we all are tempted to psychoanalyze them a little bit, but I tend to just kind of watch their conduct and behavior and then draw conclusions from that. I guess I'd answer it by saying I draw kind of a couple of broad conclusions. One, I think they have a tendency to look at their foreign policy through the lens of domestic concerns and priorities first. If you're General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, the first 5 things you think about when you wake up in the morning are probably not whether Hezbollah is rocketing northern Israel this morning. I think the first 5 things you think about are domestic. How do I keep myself in power? How do I create X million new jobs? How do I grow the economy at a requisite percentage? How do I deal with a whole variety of domestic priorities? And that's the lens through which they express both their disapproval of the policies of other governments toward them. It's the origin of a lot of their focus on the Taiwan-related issues. And I think it's why they get particularly exercised about some aspects of American policy in particular. But I will say, aside from the domestic piece, I think their foreign policy is becoming more assertive within the region. And my view is that there are 2 basic components to that. One, I think, to be blunt about it, that they'd like to exercise a veto over what happens in the region on anything that they perceive may be inimical to their interests. And then second, they'd like to leverage their greatest strength, which is their economic offering, to build at minimum webs of interdependence with other Asian countries. And then second, potentially to use that as coercive leverage on other countries. They're having a lot more success, I think, on the second than on the first. On the first, there's a lot of stuff happening in the region they don't like. They don't like AUKUS, the US, Australia, UK agreement. They don't like the Quad. They don't like the US-India relationship. They don't like what the US is doing with the Philippines. And all the jumping up and down has not really attenuated a lot of those aspects of American policy, for example. On the second, they're having a lot more success because they're able to leverage, as we've talked about on the podcast, first the map, right? You can build highways, you can build bridges, you can be a builder, a trader, a lender, an investor. but also, as I'm implying, they're leveraging economic gravity. Now, the last thing I'd say, a lot of people go beyond that, and they'll say what China really wants is to basically have a Sino-centric region that runs off Chinese standards. That may or may not be the case. We don't need to litigate it. I think that's not actually the way the region is shaping up, because the reality is most economies are not running off Chinese standards, and in fact, they're not running off American preferred standards either. There's a lot of fragmentation on everything, data standards, trade standards, investment standards. And so what we have is a very diverse region in which China's not able to dictate outcomes, but has had some success, I think, in building webs of interdependence that strengthen the coercive side of their policy and just getting countries to think over the horizon about how China might react to things.
You mentioned data standards, investment standards, and other standards. One of the other big standards, and I think this represents a gigantic sea change, is in technology standards. One of the biggest changes that has taken place across the last decade is just sort of how, and as you so nicely put it, economics and technology have collapsed together, right, into one thing. So the competition is so very much focused right now on the technological competition. There's no, I mean, I'm not sorry, I didn't mean economics, I meant national security, because technology touches so very much both on national security and, of course, on the economy. So these two things have collapsed together. We tend to see the world through a securitized lens. How has that worked? We're pushing Southeast Asian countries now to sort of choose sides. It's Huawei or the highway for the Chinese. For the Americans, it's no Huawei, right? How is that working out for America? How have we done in our effort to force that choosing of sides?
Well, I mean, the U.S. maintains it's not asking countries to choose sides. But, I mean, it is. I mean, try putting Huawei in your 5G backbone and see how the U.S. feels about that, right? So, have China do your cloud computing and see what the U.S. wants to do with you on tech. So the reality is, people make choices, and it at least puts constraints on what you can do with the U.S. I think Southeast Asia is a good proxy, because if you sit with like 11 Japanese defense hawks, you get a particular view on how the region is shaping up. But if you look at the region through the prism of countries and elites and publics that are more skeptical of America's long-term commitment to the region, it gives you a more accurate picture both of the challenges the Americans face and also of how they're doing. I think in Southeast Asia in particular, we're in kind of the third wave of a regional fear of abandonment by the United States. And the first wave I'd call fear of security abandonment. The second is of economic abandonment, and the third is now, and I'd call it ideological abandonment. And it's important because the U.S. isn't doing very well, in my view. Security abandonment, this is basically 1975. So the U.S. withdraws from Vietnam in 73, loses the Vietnam War in 75, and a lot of countries in Southeast Asia basically thought the U.S. was going to walk away from the region. And a lot of the architecture in Southeast Asia, things like the ASEAN Regional Forum, for example, were invented precisely to keep outside powers engaged. The U.S. in this area has overcome a lot of the fear. We love to sail boats and fly planes around. And countries like the U.S. flying planes and sailing boats around because, let's face it, they're afraid of China. And so having the U.S. either as a direct security provider or as an over-the-horizon security provider is both reassuring and leverages something the U.S. happens to be very good at. Okay, so those fears of abandonment, I think, have largely been overcome, and the U.S. is still pretty well anchored in the region. Now, the economic abandonment fear, that happened in 97. Remember, the U.S. bailed out Mexico in 1994, refused to bail out Thailand, and 3 years later, and a lot of countries in the region basically looked at the U.S. and said, "Hey, do you care about us still?" That was the moment, as we've talked about on the podcast before, when a lot of these Pan-Asian ideas, institutions, ideologies, swap agreements, trade deals were invented in the region on a Pan-Asian basis precisely because countries thought the U.S. might abandon them. Now, on the business side, there's no reason to fear abandonment, right? I mean, U.S. investment, U.S. origin investment in the 10 ASEAN countries alone absolutely dwarfs China. It's like $225 billion cumulatively. China's much smaller. So U.S. business isn't going anywhere, but where the U.S. isn't faring well is that business is not the end of the story. What a lot of countries in Southeast Asia want is the U.S. anchored in the region as a rule writer, norm setter, standard setter. And that includes being committed to agreements that are designed to lock that in. And as we all know, the U.S. has withdrawn from that role. CPTPP, U.S. is missing in action. RCEP, the U.S. would be missing in action because it's built on an ASEAN plus 6 and now ASEAN plus 5 foundation. DIPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, the U.S. is not in. So on not one, not two, but 3 agreements that are locking in standards for Southeast Asia and others, the U.S. is basically MIA. Now, the U.S. response to that is to ritualistically chant IPEF, IPEF, IPEF.
Right.
But
Indo-Pacific Economic
yeah, except that the problem there, the reason the U.S. is focused on things like IPEF is because it addresses and focuses on things that are outside the scope of those agreements, things like digital trade. But
Big problem with IPEF.
well, big problem with IPEF for a lot of reasons, but one is that actually the partners the U.S. most wants to lean on, countries like Korea, actually have a very different view of data standards, things like data localization. The last thing I was going to say, sorry to drone on long, is the current challenge the U.S. has is that the latest wave is what I would call ideological abandonment fears. By ideological abandonment, it's fear that the U.S. is walking away from ideological commitments it's had to openness. Openness in the region, a lot of countries say, does the U.S. still welcome the kind of openness that would include a Chinese role in the region? You don't seem too open to China. And the U.S. has an answer to that, but that's what countries in the region fear. But more importantly, a lack of commitment to openness at home, to an open economy at home. Trump is part of that story, but not the end of the story. When Kathy Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, talks about worker-centric trade policy, a lot of Asians pipe up and they say, hey, man, we got workers too. Right? You want to talk about worker-centric? Well, what about our workers? So it appears to many countries that the U.S. is becoming more parochial and therefore more closed. And countries will therefore become as selfish about their national interests as the U.S. is going to be about its own national interests. And so I think the U.S. hasn't figured out how to navigate that set of fears in a way that conveys a continuing commitment to openness, but addresses some of the political realities here we have on both sides of the aisle that are actually leading to much more closed, to economic policies that appear more protectionist and more closed.
So on your third point, in terms of sort of its ideological abandonment, it certainly dialed up in some regards the rhetorical ideological commitment, but not where it really matters in openness and things like that. Where they really have kind of gone in full is in the first. There's certainly no more fear of security abandonment. In fact, as you've said many times, and I think you coined a delicious phrase, you said that the danger is that the United States becomes only a security provider in the region, becomes the Hessians of Asia. I love that phrase, and I repeated it wherever possible. You've also argued correctly, I think, that even if the U.S. doesn't lean in economically as ideally it should, that doesn't mean that China suddenly begins, to fill that vacuum and write all the rules. That's not what has happened. What in fact has happened? I mean, Obama had warned about this, right? If we're not writing the rules, then China does. But China is not writing the rules. What is in fact happening? How would you more accurately describe the situation on the ground?
Fragmentation. I mean, I think, so the Obama references to a conversation we had on the podcast. So President Obama in 2016 gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal, and he was asked to make the case for the TPP. And Sophie will remember this. It was with Jerry Seib of the Wall Street Journal. And he gave a very interesting answer that says a lot about the way Americans think. He said, well, we need to be in the TPP because if America doesn't write the rules, China's going to write the rules out in that region. So you got 3 scenarios, right? It's either an American-centric region, it's a China-centric region, or it's like bipolarity in the Cold War, where countries choose sides and you line up on one side or the other. So as I told you, if President Obama had been right about that, then when Trump withdrew the U.S. from TPP, what should have happened? China should have come in and written the rules. But as we all know, that's not what happened. Instead, what happened was the other 11 got together and solidified the rules with neither the U.S. nor China in the room. And what I see happening, both in the setting of national level standards, but also in the attempt by a lot of countries to export their indigenous rules and standards and make them default standards, is basically we're going to end up with a patchwork. So what we're going to end up with is a region that's neither bipolar nor unipolar. It's not Sino-centric nor American-centric. It's basically fragmentation. And That's tougher for, there's a lot of business people in the audience. Good luck navigating that. That's going to be a lot tougher, right? You want to do business in India. Good luck with Indian data localization standards, which are all about Indian law enforcement that doesn't want foreign companies to store Indian citizens' data offshore. But the reality is, fragmentation also means, from the American perspective, you don't get a Sino-centric region. And for a lot of American policymakers, that's not such a bad outcome. So it begs the question, if the region isn't Sino-centric, is that okay for American interests? And my answer to that question is no. But a lot of people in Washington answer that question by saying yes. And so how you answer that question depends a lot on what your orientation is. Just because China doesn't dominate the region doesn't mean the Americans aren't withdrawing. And the U.S. needs to, as my friend Joe Hockey, who's a former Australian ambassador to the U.S., once put it, rediscover its roots as a standard-setting nation. It matters who actually writes the rules. And if the U.S. doesn't want to write rules anymore, that's fine. But then it should, number one, shut up about a rules-based order. And number two, a lot of its companies, market participants, people are going to wonder why the U.S. wants to abdicate that responsibility. That was part of it wasn't just about boats and planes. That was a big part of American leadership in this part of the world for a long time.
I want to drill down a little bit and ask you why you think you would answer that question. That no, it's not a good thing. Is it just because the complexities that different data regimes will bring to American business, or what are the other?
Well, for two reasons. I mean, one is, as we've discovered in Russia, foreign multinational companies can operate under anybody's rules, right? Like German companies were very active in Russia under Russian rules. American multinationals have been doing business in China for 30 years under Chinese rules. China rewrites the rules, everybody adapts to the rules, or you leave, right? You want to stay, you do. So rules can be more open, more closed, more protectionist, less protectionist. They can be more state-centric, they can be less state-centric. They can be more market-driven, less market-driven. If you want a region that runs off market-based standards, that privileges the private sector, that has technology openness, that has data that crosses borders easily, that can happen or not happen. And so if the U.S. thinks it has an equity in that, it has a dog in that fight, then the U.S. government needs to be part of that discussion. But then the second thing, which goes back to something I said to you earlier, is the democracies in the region are not on the same page on a lot of these questions. I mean, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of aspects of Indian economic policy that don't look that different from Chinese economic policy. It's very state-centric. There's a lot of intrusion by Indian law enforcement. Korea, you mentioned data. I did a volume at the Carnegie Endowment called The Korean Way with Data. It was an edited volume. Guess what, folks? The Korean way with data ain't the American way with data. And it's not GDPR either. It's got a lot of localization provisions. So just because it's not the Chinese way with data doesn't necessarily mean, I see Sam Sag sitting there, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be exactly what U.S. firms want to see. So in the Indian case, for example, you had a lot of companies, Walmart bought Flipkart. You have a lot of American companies that made big investments in India and have now discovered they have to operate in a rulemaking context that they don't like. And so they're spending a lot of time complaining both to New Delhi and Washington about it, but not getting traction, so they have to adapt. So that's a long way of saying rules matter. And once rules are baked in, it's hard to change them. So you need to be present at the creation, as Dean Acheson once wrote. And I think the U.S. has a dog in that fight, personally.
Just now you suggested that the democracies in the region aren't always on the same page when it comes to some of these rules. There are other things that they aren't on the same page on as well. Last night we had I'm widening the aperture now to look at the broader region to include South Asia. We had a conversation, a podcast last night with Eric Olander and Maria Repnikova, where a lot of our time was spent talking about the sort of state of play in the region. We looked at the global South primarily in the aftermath of February 24th, 2022, and now after October 7th of this year, and where we've seen sort of I don't know what to make of it, a schism maybe, a sort of more pronounced differences among the countries of the global South, to include many of the countries of South and Southeast Asia. How does this look from Beijing's perspective? Is this an opportunity to pluck some low-hanging fruit? Does this play well for Beijing, or does this ultimately play better into the American hand?
Sorry, what's this?
What?
Is the global South fertile ground for China to expand its influence?
Yeah, we've seen just such a different reaction in the global North and the global South to the Hamas attacks on Israel and Israel's response, to the Ukraine war, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What does the landscape now look like? Does this help Beijing in the region, or does it hurt it?
Yeah, I mean, I use the term global south because it's a good way to draw a binary with the OECD economies, basically, right? There's OECD, then there's the global south. But there's a lot of, I mean, Eric would know that. I mean, there's huge diversity in the global south. Political diversity, economic diversity, strategic diversity. They're promiscuous about their partnerships. Because as I've said to you, if you use mathematics as your metaphor, for most of them, the name of the game with partnerships, it's addition and multiplication. It's not subtraction and division. So is it fertile ground for Beijing to expand it? Sure, because Beijing has an offering that if your goals are growth, employment, upskilling, opportunity, sustainability, China's got lots that it offers to these countries. Having said that, I don't think there's a lot of agreement in the global south on a lot of the big strategic questions beyond 250,000 feet. I mean, the Israel thing's not new. There's always been a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian cause in the global south. The Ukraine thing is not surprising to me. I mean, it's a distant conflict. What does it really matter? It's in Europe. What does it really matter if you're Rwanda? It's not really front and center in terms of your concerns. Where I think the global south as a construct is more interesting than just looking at it as a playing field for thinking about these big major power relationships is where countries are looking for solutions to their own problems. And I'll give you an example that's not China, it's India. You know, on something like financial inclusion, there's huge swaths of the global south where people are just unbanked, right? They're outside the organized financial system. And women especially are unbanked. They're outside the organized financial system. So where do countries look for solutions to move people from the unorganized financial system into the financial system for financial inclusion? Does the US have solutions? Does Europe have solutions? No, in many cases, countries like India have solutions. India took hundreds of millions of people and through a stack of technologies called India Stack, and then a personal identification number called Aadhaar that's linked to your mobile phone, moved millions of people into the organized financial system, took the unbanked and made them banked. That's a model that is much more relevant for people in the Middle East or Central Asia than anything the US is offering. So then to your very direct question, is China offering models or things that can be exported and scaled? In some areas, yes, but in a lot of areas, it's not clear to me that China has all the solutions. And I think that a lot of countries in the global south are going to be quite promiscuous in terms of where they look for those solutions. So China will be judged based not just on how much investment it dumps into country X or how many roads and bridges it builds, because those have proved to be white elephants in a lot of places, but to what extent its experience as a recently developing, as a developing country offers models that can be exported and used elsewhere, and it has competition on that. And so the good news for China is the Americans don't necessarily have all the solutions, but the bad news is that there are a lot of other countries like India that have solutions that can be much more relevant. To me, that's the more interesting way about looking at a huge swath of the world. Where are people looking for solutions to the problems that actually matter, rather than just saying where'd they line up in some General Assembly vote on Russia, which is really kind of a distant conflict to them. Does that make sense?
It sure does. And I just want to make sure that everyone understands that in calling out the promiscuity of countries of the global south, Evan is in no way trying to slut shame the whole region. So, and I want to thank you for your time and for your words of wisdom. Evan Feigenbaum, give it up. Stand up, man. Think about